Well, good morning. My name is Keith Priddy, and I'm the president and CEO of Northwood University, and it's my privilege to welcome all of you to this, our 11th annual economic symposium here at Bay Harbor. We started doing special events here at Bay Harbor 11 years ago and decided as a part of that we wanted to share the special expertise of our university, our focus on business and economics, our focus on free markets and entrepreneurship, our focus on Judeo-Christian values and what we call the Northwood idea seemed to resonate in this area of the state. And so we, for each of the last 10 years, have shared on this Saturday morning some of the extraordinary talent that is a part of our university or a friend of our university, and that's certainly the talent we have today for you to hear fit those categories very well. Now, before we begin our program, let me do just a couple of introductions here. I see a number of members of our Board of Trustees. I'm not going to introduce them all individually, but would our trustees stand just so that the rest of the audience know who you are and the governance and leadership that they provide for our university? I also saw somewhere, I'm not seeing him right now, but here we go. Justice Curtis Wilder, the newest justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, has joined us this morning. Kurt, thank you for being here. We appreciate all you do and your rule of law focus on the court, and probably he has more trial court and appellate court experience than almost any other judge in this state, so it's a true honor to have you here with us today. Thank you for being here. Now, we've got a great program for you this morning, a program that I'm not going to delay and talk a whole lot about except to introduce our two presenters today, and we're very honored to have Dave Camp as one of our presenters. Dave and I go back to, I hesitate to guess, sometime in the early 80s when he was working for a congressman but wasn't yet a congressman, I think is when we first met. And he's had an extraordinary career that has served all of us in so many different ways. He presently serves as a senior policy advisor within Pricewaterhouse Washington National Tax Service practice, where he provides a perspective to all of their clients on important tax policy issues, including tax reform, the economy, and the impact of proposed policy changes on businesses across this country. He helps companies navigate the dynamic legislative and regulatory process coming from Washington and the states, and develop successful strategies to advance those policies and improve economic growth and competition in global markets. Chairman Camp served us in the United States Congress from 1991, he was a member of Congress for 24 years, and from 1991 to 2015, he represented us in the 4th Congressional District, and those of us that live in Midland or in the expansive 4th Congressional District were always proud to have Dave representing us in the United States Congress. From 2010 to 2014, he was chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means, and really has been recognized for his leadership on tax reform. As chairman of that committee in those years, he presented the most comprehensive both personal and corporate tax reform proposals that had been seen since the Reagan years. And unfortunately, Congress didn't find a way to listen to their champion, but he has presented issues that are today very, very important, as this important topic is again in front of us. While in Congress, he served in numerous other responsibilities. He was part of the House Republican leadership team. He was a member of the Joint Committee on Taxation, and in fact served as its vice chair and chair for a couple of different terms each, as that rotated back and forth between the House and the Senate. He was a member of the National Commission on Fiscal Policy and Reform, and has led the tax reform working group in Congress for many, many years. In addition to all of those things, he holds an honorary degree from Northwood University, as the ticket says right on his name tag. He is a great friend. He and his family have been supporters of our university literally since the university began in 1959. It is a true honor to introduce to you today our first guest speaker, Dr. David Camp.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, thank you, Keith, very much. And what Keith didn't tell you is when I was a state representative for one term, the first letter congratulating me on being a state representative was from Keith Priddy when he had another job. And I think that just sort of tells you how he's on it, whatever it is. And so really appreciate the leadership you've brought to Northwood and appreciate the great contributions Northwood's made to the community, to the state, and obviously the leadership that Northwood is really trying to instill in students as they embark on their careers, as well as the emphasis on free enterprise. You know, a lot of times people ask me, and I say, well, you know, the private sector does things that are beyond the power of government to give, and there would be no government if there weren't a strong and healthy, vibrant private sector. So when we hear about people touting all these programs that government can do to make people's lives better, they wouldn't be there. So I appreciate what you celebrate and what you teach, and obviously my brother was a graduate of Northwood University, and really appreciate all of that. Tim and I have decided we're each going to speak for about a few minutes each, and then we'll open it up to questions and hopefully some discussion on these issues that are raised. But I was asked here to really sort of talk a little bit about the whole idea of tax reform, and so I think you're very brave to start out your Saturday morning with a discussion on tax. There's lots of hot coffee over there, so if it gets too in the weeds, rein me back in. But a lot of people ask me, how did I even get started on this issue? And when I was in sort of Congress those years, and as you grow in leadership there and have more responsibility, I saw the recession of 2008, and I saw that Michigan went deeper than almost every other state, maybe except for Nevada. And so I thought one of the ways that we could really get our economy moving again was through pro-growth tax reform. The other area that I really felt was important is having been on the Simpson-Bowles Commission and having been on the super committee, which ended up not being very super, we never could come to an agreement between the administration and the Congress, the Obama administration and the Congress, on how much revenue the government should have. As you know, the president wanted to have significantly more revenue, higher taxes. Republicans did not want to do that, and there could just never be any agreement. And so one of the ways I thought maybe of solving that problem is pro-growth policies that actually might grow the economy, and when the economy grows, actually more revenue goes to the government. So that was sort of a second reason that I thought it was really important to pursue tax reform as one of the ways we could sort of make our economy better. And then the third reason was, and there's actually more than three, but the third reason really was the competition we were seeing from overseas and internationally. More and more companies were redomiciling or moving their headquarters for tax purposes. They'd still have a substantial presence here in the United States, but on paper, their headquarters was actually in a foreign country. And the concern there was that the growth then in those entities would be where the headquarters was. First, the CFO moves over there, and then the support staff moves over there. And actually coming from Midland, a small town with a big company, whenever we need to strengthen the fabric of the community, we usually go to people that work at the corporate headquarters to lead the United Way campaign or to chair the hospital board. And so those corporate headquarters jobs are really some of the best jobs that a community can have. So I saw this concern, not necessarily that all headquarters would uplift and uproot completely and move to another country, but that the future, the growth would be in those other areas. And I really wanted to make sure we did something to stop that. And on the international level, when you look at tax reform hadn't been done in a generation, the last point is the complexity of our tax code. I often say, it's 10 times the size of the Bible with none of the good news. I mean, literally there's been a change a day for the last decade. So it's just very difficult to keep track of it. And particularly for those small business owners, they have to hire a preparer. So many, And look, when I did this in the Ways and Means Committee, we had 30 hearings. I had, bipartisan working groups. I had a website. Senator Baucus, my counterpart in the Senate, and I traveled the country. And so I did a lot of background work, but one of the things I heard most from sort of small business owners was the compliance problem. And they would sign a raft of papers, and they say, I don't even know what I signed. And of course, when you do hear from the IRS, it's always by a letter, and it's always on a Friday night, and so you can't do anything about it till Monday. But people actually live in fear of sort of getting that because they really don't know what they've signed. So I thought if we could simplify our tax code and make it more straightforward, particularly for individuals and families and small businesses, that could really help. And then there was another area I really wanted to pursue. For all those years in Congress, tax policy was always evaluated on what we call a static basis, which means they assumed that no matter what policy Congress passed, the economy would not change. It would not grow. It was a fixed set, and it would never change. And it always struck me as high school physics, which wasn't my favorite subject, but they always said in high school physics, assume there's no gravity. Well, you go outside and there is gravity in the real world. Well, it's sort of like static scoring. They assume that the economy doesn't grow or change, and we know that tax policy does change the behavior of individuals and businesses. So one of the things I worked very hard on is getting this thing called dynamic scoring as an evaluation of tax policy. So you're going to hear this debate. The reason I'm going into this background is you're going to hear this as we move forward, hopefully, on the debate on tax reform about a dynamic score and what does it mean. And so I worked very hard for several years to get into the House rules and get the economic modeling done. And so H.R. 1, which is the tax bill that I wrote with a number of people on the committee, was the first tax bill to be dynamically scored. So when I did all the changes that I wanted to do and the committee did and lowered rates and broadened the base, which was a Reagan-style approach to tax reform, we had an analysis that showed that the economy, the GDP, would grow by 20%, that we would see 2 million jobs created, and that we'd see median incomes go up by about $1,500 a year. And if you think back on the 2016 campaign, I think you saw both parties have this issue where people felt that they were left behind. Now, the parties have very different solutions to that problem, but there is this sense out there, and it's accurate. If you look at GDP, which is about $52,000, or median income, which is about $52,000 a year, it really has been flat for almost a decade and actually declined after the 2008 recession. Has come up a little bit, but basically it's been flat. So if you think about sort of upward mobility and that my kids are going to have a chance to do better than I did, you really hadn't seen that. The other factor of sort of this Great Recession was that the length of time that it takes for the standard of living to double in the United States actually doubled to over 70 years. So it means that a person would work their entire life and not necessarily see an appreciable difference in the standard of living. So again, this sense that the country is going to, the American dream is there for my kids, that they're going to do better than their parents did, has been very much called into question. And the reason I'm saying this is I think it's very much a part of the background in terms of the debate we're going to have on tax reform. The Wall Street Journal had a poll about 3 weeks ago, and they polled the flip counties, the counties that had voted for Barack Obama in 2012 but voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And they found that 71% of the people in those counties still said that the things aren't getting better. So I think that is one of the drivers of tax reform, this a sense that we do have to try to get some more economic growth, even though we're actually seeing some improvement in that, it looks like this year, but some sustained growth, and tax reform is one way to do that. So what are some of the approaches here? Well, in H.R. 1, as I mentioned, I did kind of a Reagan-style approach, which is lower rates and broaden the base. So on the individual side, what I did was doubled the standard deduction. And that is a huge amount of simplification because it meant that 95% of the people would not have to itemize. So that meant no record keeping. You could file a simplified 1-page or 2-page. I know they're trying to get it on a postcard. I don't know if they'll be that successful, but you'll be able to have a much more simplified tax reform. And you're actually seeing that approach taken in H.R. 1 That's the same approach that the new chairman, Kevin Brady, took in the House, what's called the House Blueprint. I don't know if you've heard about that. But the approach that they're taking currently in the Congress, which is to double the standard deduction, lower the number of rates to 3. So you've got that approach taken in H.R. 1, that approach taken in the Blueprint, and that approach really in the Trump proposal as he was running for president. So you actually have some commonality there. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to do that. But what you find on the individual level is people are willing to make almost any change you suggest if it's a simpler, more understandable tax code. So I think there is some space there to do that. The second approach is where I see some common ground is actually on this international side that I've talked about. There really is some bipartisan consensus here that we've got to do something about companies that are moving overseas. And it isn't that they shouldn't be doing business overseas. I remember we had the CEO of Procter & Gamble before the committee, and he said, we're not going to make diapers in Pennsylvania and ship them to Germany. We're going to make the diapers in Germany. So you're going to have some market share issues where companies are going to be doing business overseas. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. What you want is U.S. companies headquartered here, platformed here, doing business around the world. So on the international side, we have the highest statutory corporate rate in the world. We have the second highest effective tax rate in the world. We are the only major economy left with what's called a worldwide system of taxation. And not to get into too much detail, but it means that in order to bring dollars that a U.S. company earns overseas back to the U.S., they pay a double tax. So as a result, that money stays overseas. And they're estimating it's about $2.5 trillion in U.S. companies' profits that are, quote unquote, stranded overseas because they're not going to bring it back and pay this toll charge. So one of the things that we're going to try to do is lower the corporate rate significantly, move to what's called a modern tax system, whether it's called a territorial or dividend exemption, but off this worldwide system, and then allow the dollars that are earned overseas to come back without that double tax. And then I expect you'll see a toll charge on the accumulated dollars, require those be brought back to the U.S. over a period of years to help fund the lower corporate rate. So there's actually some common ground there on terms of that. And I think that is one area that you could see some unification. Now, there's some big issues they haven't resolved. And there's a bit of a difference between the administration and the Congress. And I don't want to go over my time, but I'll just very quickly say whether this should be comprehensive tax reform, should it be individual, small business pass-through, international, corporate, or should this be some lesser version? Should this be permanent or should this be temporary? And obviously, how you pay for it makes a big difference. The administration has been slow in filling some of the cabinet positions and some of the sub-cabinet positions. Part of that I blame on the opposition party by delaying. Just as a quick fact, you can require 30 hours debate on any presidential appointment, and a lot of the sub-cabinet positions do require Senate approval. For the Obama administration, I think 3 positions had 30 hours of debate. For the Trump administration, 30 positions have had 30 hours of debate. So some of this is slowness in nominating people. Some of this is obviously the Senate taking their prerogatives, the minority, and taking longer. So we haven't got some of the deep policy people in place in order to move something as important as tax reform forward. Now, just before they take an August break, they did finally approve the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. So that's an important position. That's normally the person that sort of runs the traps on the Hill and helps get something done. But there's this overarching issue of will this be permanent or will this be temporary, and will it be comprehensive or will it be something less, and that has not been resolved. So in closing, let me just say, I think that typically this year I've been optimistic that tax reform would happen. We have a president who wants to do it. We have congressional leadership who want to do it. None of that was there when I was there. The president didn't want to do it, and the congressional leadership didn't want to do it, for reasons I can go into later. But they do want to do that now, and it is, I think, critical, given the nature of the 2016 election, where the president really promised to make the lives of average people better, that there's a tremendous amount of pressure to get some pro-growth policies in place. Tax is one area. There's others, but tax is one area they can do that. Now, my biggest concern on all of this is, will the president have the political capital to move something this significant forward? Certainly up until the last couple of weeks, I would have answered that yes. He does have the political capital to move it forward. If you look at polls, people who voted for him still support him. He's lost some of the people who had voted for Barack Obama that then voted for him, and he's lost, obviously, some of the people who are described as independents. But in terms of his base, they have still been there. Now, I don't know about recent events, and I always am very careful not to make predictions on events of the last few days, but clearly the distractions that have come to this president, some of his own making. But I would just say I think one of the greatest existential threats to this presidency is the Russia investigation. We just don't know where that's going to go. But anyway, any of these events, whether it's Charlottesville or the Russia investigation or other items, they can have the potential to derail a legislative agenda. So, a couple of weeks ago, I was still optimistic. It's not encouraging that you have now members of his own party, and some of them aren't the people who rush to the microphones. Some more substantials are really distancing themselves. But the policies are so critical that I think they have an obligation to really try to get this done, and we'll see. I'm encouraged that there's been a lot of work done on tax. I think they have an opportunity to move this forward. I think there was some time wasted on the what we call the border adjustment, but the calendar is the second biggest threat to this legislative agenda. They are simply just running out of time. So with that, I look forward to maybe taking your questions. I don't mean to eat into Tim's time, but thank you very much for having me here, and look forward to the discussion later. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Our next speaker is our own Dr. Tim Nash, and Tim has been a part of this economic symposium since we first began it. Tim has probably the longest title in our university in that he is Senior Vice President of Strategic and Corporate Alliances, and he's also the director of the Robert and Janice McNair Center for the Advancement of Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship at Northwood University. And in addition to that, he holds the Robert McNair Chair. And so he has vast responsibilities in our institution. The McNair Center is a new gift and opportunity for our university. It is the place where we do economic research. And Tim has been leading research efforts that have supported the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, have supported the Dow Chemical Company, have supported the National Minority Automobile Dealers Association, and so many different organizations with excellent research performed by Tim, by other members of our faculty, by some of our students, and faculty from other institutions. It's a very inclusive group under Tim's leadership. Tim joined Northwood, actually came to us in 1976 as a student athlete, and graduated from Northwood with his BBA in 1980, continued on, received his master's in economics from Central Michigan University, and ultimately his doctorate from Wayne State University. He's a professor of economics and business at our undergraduate program level. He's the former dean and still a faculty member in the Richard DeVos Graduate School of Management. And then, as I've said, he leads the McNair Center, which we're so excited about. In fact, we have a new home for the McNair Center that's under construction and will be unveiled in January of this coming year. Tim has traveled extensively across the globe to 30 different countries. He has written for so many different organizations. He's an adjunct scholar at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and at the American Legislative Exchange Council in Washington, D.C. He's co-authored books, and maybe most importantly, he married up. His wife Pam is here in the room, a Northwood grad, and his 4 adult children have produced he and Pam with 9 grandchildren now, which is the love of their life. So please welcome Dr. Tim Nash.
Thanks, Keith. Ladies and gentlemen, it is once again my honor to be here. This program is very special to us. I would like to echo a couple of comments that people have made, but first and foremost, how about a hand for one of the great private university presidents in the country, Keith Priddy. And would also like to say before I get started that, number one, I'm going to steal his quote about 10 times the size of the Bible with all the good news. David, that was a great quote. And it's also an honor to be on the program with Dave Camp. He truly is one of this country's great patriots and a person that behind the scenes does it the right way. And I just wish there were more David Camps in Washington, D.C. today. So thank you, David. Some of you have heard me speak before. Sometimes I like to start out programs like this with a short story. A few years ago, I was speaking, was the keynote speaker for the German Automobile World Congress in Frankfurt, and having dinner the night before, and my friend Antje Voltemann, she was the chief economist for the equivalent of the German National Automobile Dealers Association. And she said to me, you know, Tim, you should start your talk out tomorrow with a joke. You know, we Germans have a keen sense of humor. I was thinking, well, you know, Claudia Fry, David Fry, you know, they're German. Sounds good. I'm all ears. And so she said, here's a great story for you. And it will explain all the data on those slides that I saw that you have. So it really makes sense as to what I'm about to show you, so listen closely to German humor. There's this economist, and this economist is walking outside of Frankfurt down a country road and comes to this big farm. And he gets to the farm, and the farm has a huge pen in front of the main barn, and it's full of sheep. And the economist is just standing there. You know, he's an econometrician, so he's a real math person, and he's trying to measure the length and the width of the pen, and then he's looking at the average size of the sheep. And farmer has no idea who this guy is, and the farmer walks up to him and says, "Sir, may I help you? What are you doing?" And the economist says, "I'm trying to count the number of sheep you have in your pen." And the farmer says, that's impossible. There's no way you can do that. It's just too dense. And again, he doesn't know who this guy is, and the economist looks at it one more time, and he says, "You have 946 sheep in your pen." And the farmer says, "Huh?" And he looks at him and he says, How did you know that?" And he said, "Well, if I tell you, what will you give me?" And he says, "If you can convince me as to how you did it," he says, you can have one of the sheep and take it home for dinner." And the economist then says, "Well, here's what I did. Here's the algorithm." And the farmer looks at him and says, "Okay, hey, take one home." Economist leans over, picks up an animal, he starts walking down the road, and the farmer looks at him and says, "Double or nothing. I bet I can guess what you do for a living." And the economist thinks, "Geez, mutton for 2 months, this will be great." He goes, "You're on." Farmer says, "Well, you're an economist." Now the economist is shocked. The economist says, "How did you know that?" He says, "Well, if you put down my dog, I'll tell you." So the important thing today, ladies and gentlemen, is we're going to look at numbers, but what's important is, do you really understand, you know, what the numbers are and what the numbers are all about? And so, you know, we as economists, we're good at putting numbers together. We're not necessarily good at explaining all of the ins and outs of the numbers. And so if you look at this this first slide here, as Dave noted, the global economy was not just bad for the United States, but it was bad for the world. It's probably the only time in recorded history since World War II that global GDP was actually zero. The next year, the global economy rebounded. The United States certainly did better the second half of 2009. But if you look at the global economy, one of the things that's important to note is that the United States is not getting the help from the global economy and global economic growth that it's gotten in the past. And so if you look at it the last 4 or 5 years, the global economy has grown at roughly half of what it had grown in 2009. And the other part of it is China, which is the largest player in the global economy outside of the United States. Now, at least in purchasing power terms, larger than Europe, it's beginning to slow. China was growing at 14% in the late 1990s, early into the 21st century, and is now growing at, if you look at what I would describe as real data, it's growing at about 6.5%, which we would obviously love to have in the United States, but is quite slow by Chinese standards. The next slide, it speaks to some of the things that Dave was addressing. And my talk today is really based on looking at the U.S. economy and the Michigan economy. As Keith pointed out, we are in the process of finishing the research and the publication of the 6th annual competitiveness study that the McNair Center at Northwood University does in joint cooperation with the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. And as you look at state taxes and state regulations, Michigan has come a long way. If I gave you the historical data here as it relates to state-friendly business climate, Michigan 15 years ago was 24. And most of the change has come under Governor Snyder and a bipartisan House and Senate in the state of Michigan. But Michigan has become a highly competitive state as it relates to tax law, the complexity of it, and the tax rate. The other thing that I didn't put in here, but that will be in our study, so if you're interested in a copy of the study or some of the other things I'll talk about, make sure that I get your business card and we'll email those to you. But the state of Texas is in a real interesting quandary. Texas, 6 years ago, was the 7th best state in the country for tax law and tax policy. It dropped to number 14 last year and is probably, 14 this year. And one of the reasons why Texas is having issues, you say, well, Nash, come on, Texas has no income tax. That's true. But Texas has ever higher property taxes, and they are attracting a lot of businesses to the state by giving them tax abatements, simultaneously causing the real tax to go up on a lot of the businesses that have been loyal Texas businesses for decades. So when you look at Michigan, Michigan has a real interesting competitor in the state of Indiana, which is number 8. And Michigan has fluctuated under Governor Snyder between number 11 and number 12 for the last 6 years or so. Now, the other thing that I think is important for you to look at today in the third slide is the fact that when you're analyzing where we are today, and Chairman Camp's comments on is the budget reform and the tax reform going to fly in the United States? Can we get it through Congress? One of the real problems is the U.S. national debt. If you look at internal debt and external debt, or private versus public debt, it is now just shy, who knows, by today it might actually be over $20 trillion. I put the slide together a little over a week ago, but we're at $19.97 trillion and growing. And if you look at it, per capita debt is just over $61,000. So if you have your spouse and a couple of children, you're at about $250,000 is your share of the national debt. If you're like Pam and myself, then you multiply it times 6, and you're well over $300,000. But the other thing that's important to note is that debt per taxpayer is $165,000. And what I mean by that is twofold. One, you have a number of people that are too young or too old to be paying taxes. But the fact of the matter is, out of all the people that file taxes in the United States, only just over half actually pay taxes. 48 to 49%, when they file their taxes, either pay no taxes or actually get a tax refund, or what one of my mentors, Milton Friedman, would describe as a negative income tax. They're actually paid for filing taxes. So the fact of the matter is the national debt really constrains to a great degree some of the things that we can do as a country as it relates to bringing about economic and political reform. Next slide will give you an idea when you're looking at categories of federal spending. This was the preliminary budget for 2016. And you can see where so much of our spending goes. Social Security, unemployment, and certain labor areas, and medical and health care. You take a look at those two together, those two, ladies and gentlemen, are 60% of the federal budget. And those are two political animals that are awfully difficult to challenge. You look at how tough it's been just to have medical health care reform in this country, but simultaneously, think about what it would be like if you said to your parents or your grandparents, we're going to cut Social Security. Even though when you look at Social Security, most people receiving Social Security today got it a windfall investment. Paid nowhere near into the system what they're receiving. Something has to be done in order to look at an optimistic way of challenging the federal budget and to have tax reform. Next slide. This is something that you might find interesting, but that out of the $3.8 billion in the preliminary budget for last year, 65% of it is mandatory spending, meaning you have to change the law if you're going to cut spending in those areas. You know, to some degree, Dave can explain it better than I, but you have to have some sort of an act of Congress in order to change that mandatory or government-required spending. Now, slide 6, there's a lot of good news as it relates to Michigan and some good news with the U.S. economy. This slide shows that Michigan is leading the Great Lakes, slightly behind the U.S. average in new entrepreneurial startups per 100 people. So there's an increasing number of entrepreneurs being formed in this country and certainly in the state of Michigan. Next slide. As it relates to gross domestic product, now these are in current or nominal dollars, but if you look at this slide, first of all, the 5 states of the Great Lakes region represent almost 16% of the country's GDP. So the Rust Belt, as it's called in some terms, is still one of the largest, most powerful areas of the U.S. economy. If you think about 5 states and you look at almost 16%, we on average carry above average in terms of producing to the U.S. GDP or contributing to the U.S. GDP. What's important to note is that Michigan, in terms of looking at percent of GDP, here's maybe an interesting trivia point for you. To understand the size and scope of the U.S. economy, Michigan's the 13th largest economy in the United States. If Michigan were a free and independent country, Michigan would be the 24th largest economy in the world based on 2016 data, right between Taiwan and my motherland of Poland. So when you think about it, Michigan still is a consequential, a substantive contributor, not just on the U.S., but on the global stage. And it also is important to point out that with all the foibles and difficulties within the U.S. economy today, it is by far and away the largest player in the global economy based on current dollars, and certainly is a challenger to anything that the world economy has to offer, but simultaneously is losing ground in a relative sense in many industries to China. Okay, next slide. This takes a look at GDP in terms of overall growth. Michigan last year, in nominal terms, meaning current dollars, grew at the fastest rate by far of the Great Lakes states at 3.53%. If you converted that to discounting for inflation, meaning you looked at it based on 2009 dollars Michigan still was the #1 producing state at a growth rate of 1.85%. And just to give you a relative view, the United States economy, see where it says 2.96 last year, adjusted for inflation grew at 1.54%. But again, this is all based on current dollars. Michigan outperformed any of the Great Lakes states and the U.S. economy over 3 years and over 5 years. So the regulatory reform, the tax reform is having a positive impact on the Michigan economy. Interestingly enough, if you look at one of my favorite states, it's been #1 in our competitive index 4 out of the last 5 years when we compare Michigan to all 50 states, Texas. Texas had a very difficult year last year. The Texas economy grew in nominal terms last year at less than 0.5%, and adjusted for inflation grew at 0.43%. Do I think Texas is down and out or trending in the wrong direction? Absolutely not. But the fact of the matter is this data shows you that there are some good things happening here in Michigan in the Great Lakes region. It's a story that needs to be told, but it's also a progression that needs to be continued. We need to be more friendly as it relates to regulations, and we need to continue as the federal government debates tax reform, which I think is absolutely vital. The state of Michigan needs to continue to be more friendly as it relates to business taxes. Next slide. This is the same data, but this is per capita, meaning this is, if you looked at it, individualized it per individual. This is the closest thing that the Bureau of Economic Analysis comes to personal income. And Michigan, again, was a growth state and a leading state. As Dave noted, though, when you adjust it for inflation, Americans haven't had a real income raise, a substantial income raise in the last 15 years. So you adjust it for purchasing power, Americans are flat to maybe even in some cases a little bit behind on average. Next slide. Population growth. Keith and I often talk about this when we do a presentation for bankers in Detroit and Grand Rapids in the first third of the year or every year for the last 5 years. People forget that Michigan literally was the only state in the country from 2000 to 2010 that had a net population loss. You look at business births, business deaths. You look at people exiting the state, people coming into the state for business activity. Children being born, people dying. Take all those factors into consideration. And Michigan was the only state that had a net population loss, and it was over 50,000 net. It was much larger when it came to jobs lost. Michigan is beginning to make a comeback, but it's slow. And if you look at Michigan population growth, it's not negative like it is for Illinois, but Michigan population growth does trail the country substantially. And it impacts everything from having enough good qualified workers to expand your company to it certainly has an impact on colleges and universities, number of high school graduates over time, et cetera. Next slide. As you look at gross state product, what's interesting is if you look at the United States and you look at a lot of our counties, what's really interesting, maybe just as a point of view, is that if you look at Grand Rapids as an area, the Grand Rapids area, it's ranked the 56th largest area of economic activity in the country. But if Grand Rapids were a free and independent country, it'd be the 171st largest economy in the world. So again, these things speak to the size and scope of the U.S. economy, the size and scope of the Michigan economy. Next slide. In September, you will have the 6th year. We'll release the 6th study with the Michigan Chamber. And if you look at it in overall competitiveness, when we released the study in 2012, Michigan was 47th. Rich Studley, the president of the chamber, called Keith and I and said, are you guys sure? Because there's only 3 states that are doing more poorly than we are. And I said, yeah. He said, could you check it again? I called him back and I said, I checked it again. He said, any improvement? I said, no, we're still a strong 47. Then he said, would you check it one more time? I called him back. I said, Rich, I checked it 15 times more. We're 47. And he was very comfortable with it. And when we released the data, it showed that Michigan was highly uncompetitive in a number of areas. And this data, Keith and I were informed that it was an important study, the 180-some pages that caused Governor Snyder to have the courage to make Michigan the 21st right-to-work state in the lame duck session. The data in the state analyzes Michigan against all 50 states. And so we were very proud to find out just about less than a year ago that Bill Cole, who was then the lieutenant governor, is a Michigan grad, but was the lieutenant governor of West Virginia, used our data as justification to make West Virginia the 26th right-to-work state. So the kinds of things that we're doing is not anti-union. It is simply trying to create the most pro-business environment, not just in Michigan, but for the country as a whole. And so Michigan has moved from 47 to 25. I'll tell you that when the 2017 study comes out in about a month, we're a little better than 25 overall. We were 13 if you looked at the last 5 years. We added something new last year, and we're going to be better than 13 over the last 5 years as well. So there's a lot of good news to say about Michigan. Final slide. This just shows the indicators in comparison by bar charts. It's just a bar chart version of the table that was Exhibit 12. My final comments to you are this. Do I think the Michigan economy is moving in the right direction? Absolutely. Do I think we need to continue with regulatory reform and tax reform? No doubt about it. I'm a homer. I was born and raised in Detroit. I've lived the vast majority of my life in Midland, Michigan. I love this state, and I love it for a lot of very good reasons, and most of it is because it is a state that's malleable. It's a state that, when it's down, is a counterpuncher and has done a number of things to truly apply free market economics to improve the state. But we need to continue to understand that profit is not a dirty word, that business creates the vast majority of jobs in this state and all the revenue that allows government to exist. And it's high time that we look very closely at what we need to do to have less government in Washington and more dollars in the pockets of individuals and businesses to grow this great nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Our panelists will now take your questions, and I believe Carrie Adgate is going to come around with a microphone, so if you just raise your hand, we're happy to take any and all questions. We are recording this session so that it can be used in the classroom for our students this fall, and thus we really do need you to speak into the microphone as you ask your questions so that can be saved for our students to understand the context of this. So who has the first question for us today? Or Chairman Camp or for Dr. Nash? Rick Gerlinger, if Carrie's coming to you right now.
Is there any talk, any discussion, any thought about a national sales tax as part of the tax reform? I know there was discussion earlier. Canada has one, and if you think about, it's a consumption tax, I understand, but most states, most counties use that as a way of generating it and lowering income tax.
You've raised a very important point, and that is that when we compare ourselves to Europe, they all have value-added taxes, and we don't in the United States. I don't see that happening at the national level, either a value-added tax or a national sales tax, because under our system of government, we've left that to the states. And our states have a variety of laws affecting sales taxes. So I don't see another layer of taxation. This actually became one of the real difficult points when they were trying to do this border adjustment, trying to be more like Europe, having a tax that would be rebatable at the border and trying to make us more competitive. But it was viewed as another layer of taxation. And when you look at Europe, those value-added taxes are over 20%. And so whenever I travel, I sort of look at the cost of everyday living, clothes, food, And in those countries that have value-added taxes, it's significantly more expensive. I think the last time there was a vote on a value-added tax, there are proposals in the Congress to do that. I just don't see them getting any traction. I think it was 99-0 in the Senate, and even the sponsor voted against it. And you know, you do try not to vote against your own bills. I mean, so, but I don't see it.
You know, I would say that as it relates to tax reform, I would love to see us have that debate. However, I think a national sales tax replacing income taxes in general would be a phenomenal way to spur growth. Because in essence, you're taxing consumption, you're not taxing businesses. And you certainly would do away with most of the bureaucracy of filling out tax reforms, filing tax returns, et cetera, with a national sales tax. So whether it's the right thing to do or not, I really believe that we need tax reform quickly, but over the long term, we need to have a debate which includes a national sales tax eliminating the income tax.
You'd still have the states have the ability to issue income taxes, though. So some states don't have income taxes, so you might not completely get rid of the record keeping, even if there were a complete revoking of the income tax at the federal level.
One can read.
Carl Steffen?
It seems like, tax reform is certainly a very important factor that we need to address. But isn't the true problem the amazing amount of overspending of the federal government that is completely out of control? If we, do tax reform, which lowers, the tax, or perhaps maybe increases it, because of growth of the economy, isn't that just still leaving the gates wide open and just forcing them to borrow even more and have deficits even greater? I mean, how do we rein in spending so that we live among our means?
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting, in 2010, the debt and deficit were huge issues. They were nowhere in the 2016 election. I mean, it was pretty much a policy-free election from the get-go, but there was nothing about the national debt. And as Tim's slides pointed out, more of the spending is in what we call mandatory or entitlement programs than in discretionary. And what that means is those aren't voted on. And those are an automatic pilot increase. So there will be a need for entitlement reform. There's been a lot of effort to try to do that. As you remember, President W. Bush proposed a Social Security reform. It went nowhere. The other side had no alternative, just criticized it. I was one of the authors of welfare reform, for example, in the mid-90s, and that had significant positive impacts on moving children and families out of poverty. But I think that you saw them attempt to try to do entitlement reform in Medicaid in the health care bill, and you saw how challenging that was. And I think unless you can get both parties together on entitlements, they're just not going to move through the Congress. And clearly on Social Security, which is the big one, that there are a lot of ideas out there, but you have not had buy-in from both sides. And I think it makes it very, very difficult to do that. The president has said already he's not going to touch Social Security and he's not going to touch Medicare. He's promised that in his campaign. So I don't think you'll see anything on those two. This is something I think particularly the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, has been very interested in over the years, is entitlement reform. And they you say what you will about this health care alternative they were trying to come up with to the Affordable Care Act, but they actually did try to move forward on entitlement reform there. But obviously, the discretionary side of the budget has actually declined in real terms. The part they vote on actually has gone down. But there's this bigger piece that they don't vote on, and until that is addressed, and that's, unfortunately, I fear it will take a crisis for them to do that because it just keeps getting kicked down the road. And as we saw, of course, the debt had doubled in the last decade. And there was a lot of pushback in 10, but it really has gone away. And I think that's partly a function of low interest rates and easy money. I mean, the federal government is just printing money. So the issue isn't really in the public consciousness requiring a lot of action by Congress. But if and when interest rates increase, they're at historic lows now, the amount that is spent on servicing the debt is going to dramatically skyrocket, and that will really pressure the issue. It's an issue that the longer you wait, the harder it gets, and it should be addressed. We just haven't seen that happen. So,
DeVere?
So you're saying we can't cut spending. So with your tax reform ideas, is there truly a possibility there would be enough growth to cover the spending of government in the dynamic formula you use?
well, I don't know about that because I don't, but I think what you're looking at is if you can get a lower rate, you can then grow our economy and obviously create more jobs, and when you have more jobs, more people are paying taxes. And even though some don't pay income taxes, if you have a job, you're paying payroll taxes. So whether the policies they adopt will generate enough revenue to begin paying down the debt. Now, the bill I worked on was the first, as I mentioned, to be dynamically scored, and they gave us a range. And they said that my policies would have created between 50 and 800 billion in additional revenue to the federal government, which is a huge range. But it was the first time it was analyzed. Now they've refined the analysis, and they'll have to pinpoint that number. So you can take that growth, and you can either lower rates further, or you can begin to pay down the debt. I think the real problem we've got is there isn't even an attempt to begin to address the debt. And that, I think it's like a mortgage. You got to get a plan, and they don't really have one. So whether it will be enough to do that, it depends on what they decide to do, how far they want to lower rates, what other policies they want to adopt. But there could be significant pro-growth revenue generated through tax reform. But again, it's just a piece. I mean, one of the areas that this administration is making progress on is regulatory reform, and the regulatory burden has also affected some of these growth numbers. I saw an analysis the other day that said that already the regulatory reform that's been adopted has reduced the hours of compliance with regulation by 25 million people hours. So there's a lot of room to bring that regulatory pendulum back to the center too. So it's not just going to be one thing, but I think you could generate significant revenue through tax reform.
You know, just a quick addendum to what Dave said. If you look at the slide 5 that I had up there, one of the things that it pointed out was that last year interest on the national debt was $226 billion. And that was at an average blended interest rate of 1.9%. If, to Dave's point, interest rates go up, think about an average blended rate of 4%, 5%, which is not out of the realm of the last 30 years of economic activity. We could be paying interest on the national debt of over $500 billion. Literally, thinking about spending cuts, you could have $300 billion in real tough spending cuts with Medicare and Social Security reform, which is somewhat questionable, and have all of that literally taken away because you're paying a much higher rate of interest on the national debt. So there's a tremendous amount of complexity either way.
Yeah, and I will say that even the Republican Party isn't in agreement here. You've got some in Congress that are deficit hawks that think that that is the key issue and we need to address it. Others think that we should spend more on defense. So within the Republican Party, you've seen them not be able to adopt a budget in the last couple of years because they haven't been able to agree on how much revenue the government ought to have and where the spending should be. And one of the things that's going to be important to moving tax reform forward is that they do adopt a budget, because in the budget will be what we call these rules for the expedited process in the Senate, where you can move tax reform on 51 votes. And they have to adopt a budget to be able to do that. But as we've seen, they haven't been able to do that for a number of years. And that's going to be, I think, an important thing to watch. And that's coming this fall. And the reason why I said earlier the calendar is an issue is you've got not only the debt limit, which they'll have to deal with at some point in September. You've got FAA reauthorization. You've got reauthorizing children's health insurance. You've got a number of issues that are going to compress the calendar that I think are going to make it a real challenge. But if they cannot adapt a budget, they will need 60 votes in the Senate to close off debate to move forward on a tax reform bill. And I don't believe there are 8 Democrat senators that will come forward. I do think on tax reform you could get a couple of senators that are Democrats to support it, because not all the issues are partisan in tax reform. But again, it's a very polarized environment. So, but there are 5 Democrats running for the Senate in 18 that are in states that Donald Trump won by 19 or more points. And to me, I would look at those 5, particularly West Virginia, that Donald Trump won by 40 points. If I'm a Democrat senator running for re-election, would I want to appear more moderate and maybe work on something, particularly if there's a middle-class tax cut in the bill?
Or become a Republican like the governor recently did.
Or follow the governor.
Yeah.
Related to welfare reform,
Yeah.
it's almost impossible to hire people at this point. I mean, there literally should be no one on welfare. 50% of the people that stop in for a job or we bring in for a job can't pass a drug test, don't have transportation, a valid driver's license, and so basically are unemployable. Is there anything that's going to happen here to eliminate welfare costs and get these people back into the mainstream and working?
You know, this is one of the huge problems where you've seen states all over the country start to legalize marijuana, because then you can't pass a drug test. And so it's a very counterproductive policy, and that never really gets talked about in those national debates on that. You know, Michigan has a pretty robust job retraining program, Michigan Works. And when I first got to Congress, that was not the case in terms of Michigan's programs. But I think they have a pretty good plan of trying to get people back to work. I think one of the things you've got is a lot of competing job programs at the federal level, and that is an area that really is ripe for streamlining and trying to make them more effective. But a lot of that is grant money to the states. The states operate really their own worker programs, and those are done at a county level pretty much in the state here. But you're right, if you don't have those basic skills, and I saw a statistic in Detroit that 40% of the students don't even graduate from high school. So you're going to have an underclass that is not going to have the basic skills of. It was interesting when we had the recession. We had an economist come in and talk to the committee, and this was a couple of years ago now, and we were all thinking about the 50-year-old that had lost their job and the problem. He said, that's not who you need to worry about. He said, you need to worry about the 22-year-old. Because if they don't get the skill set of, I need to get up every day, and I need to show up on time, and I need to work. If you don't develop that skill set in your 20s, you never will develop it. So we really sort of tried to change our focus as well on that. And so it really is important to have people ready for jobs and ready for work. And I think that it's just a continual issue, and some of that is complex. There's a breakdown in the family in many cases, and other economic and social factors that run into that, and it's very hard for the federal government to solve it all. But I do think that, at least in this state, I feel pretty good about the work that Michigan Works does in trying to get them ready to go. But again, the unskilled work is not as available as it used to be.
Carrie, I think Rob Wilson has a question, and then Bill's got a question up here, so.
I think in large part, a lot of people that supported Trump are for listening to Tim's remarks this morning. Obviously, Governor Snyder's had a positive impact, or his policies are showing some traction here in Michigan. And I think a large part of voters across the country kind of had that same rationale as to why they voted for Donald Trump over, drain the swamp, all those buzzwords that were going on. They were sick of business as usual, and they wanted real, tangible change, and he was promising that. Obviously, there's been some floundering here in the first 6 months of his administration, and you sort of touched on that. But do you see, we're sitting here having a great conversation about what needs to happen, but I think that's the reason why people voted for him, because they feel like it sort of flip-flops. You tend to go Republican and then Democrat, but nobody ever feels like John Doe Citizen does not feel like it ever changes. It's just more rhetoric. So Can his administration ever get out of their own way? Can somebody take away the phone, take away the Twitter? Can we have a contract with America? I mean, you were around for that. I know the Clinton administration struggled in their first years, but can we have that moment?
You know, if you look at the Clinton administration, and I was there with 5 presidents, and the Clinton administration, President Clinton's approval rating is very similar to where Donald Trump's is right now. There's really not that much difference. And the Trump administration has just completed about 14% of his first term. So there's a lot of time. And one thing presidents do have compared to the House is time, a little more time. I do think there's still a potential to do that. And I think the problem he has is the skill set that made him an effective candidate. And I'll tell you, which was being very nimble and, being able to sort of use his gut instinct, which is very effective on the campaign trail. It is not as effective when you're leading. And I mean, think back to the Clinton administration. He fired the travel office and hired his cousin. And I mean, there was all kinds of stuff. It was Whitewater. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff going on. So, but I do think that making that transition to governing, which is very different because he's now leading a nation, and that is just so different than campaigning. And I saw the Obama administration struggle with this. In a campaign, a speech is action, but when you're governing, a speech is not action. And he would give a speech, and then there'd be nothing after it. So there has to be the model of having sort of competing interests in the White House, and then sort of have the top people rise to the top, is a model that does not work. And the reason it might have worked in real estate and doesn't work in government is he has a robust opposition party and a hostile press. And if you want to implement an agenda, you must have your team on the same page. So I think he's trying to make the shift. I think with Kelly there, you have the opportunity to do that, and they've made some changes. People, we're just walking into the Oval Office. You simply cannot do that at that level. I mean, look, I didn't even have that when I was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee with just 60 staff people. So, you've got to have a structure because he's trying to move something forward. And I know in his book he said he would get up every day and just do whatever came to his desk. And you cannot operate in government that way. You've got to try to have a plan if you want to get something done, and you got to try to move it forward. And he does. I mean, regulatory reform, tax reform, and judges. And he's had some success, and he's nominated Joan Larson to the Sixth Circuit, who's a Michigan Supreme Court justice, would be an excellent judge at that level. And Justice Wilder, I'm sure, could, confirm that. If he continues to nominate people at the level of a Neil Gorsuch, he will have an incredible legacy there. So that seems to be the agenda, but he's going to have to figure out a way not to keep going back to issues. I know someone was asking me yesterday, well, the things he's saying are important, and shouldn't he? And it's like, you can't fight every battle. And that worked for him in a campaign. It does work in a campaign when you get pushed to push back. But at this point, when you're president, there's some point where you have to say, I'm president of the United States and they're not. I remember I had a problem early on in Congress, and there was this issue and I couldn't get it dealt with. And a very good friend of mine said, you're in Congress and they're not. They can move forward. And he's got to learn to do that. So it's going to be a challenge to see whether he can. He still has the political space to do it. And winning the 4 specials, not just that voters haven't abandoned him, but winning those 4 specials has given him some political space to move an agenda. And I think tax reform, if it doesn't get done by Thanksgiving, which they're saying they'll do, I think that's a stretch. I think he has until the first quarter of 2018 to get it done still. So I think there's some time, but this last week has been a pretty tough week. I don't know how many more of those you can withstand. I hate to draw too many conclusions until we get a little more distance on it, but it certainly isn't helpful. I mean, we should be talking about tax reform, not about the Confederacy.
Bill's got a question right up here.
As I sit in the room, I'm encouraged with your mindsets, both Tim and Dave and Keith, and so much of this just seems to make common sense. You know, just to eliminate all the compliance nuisance that's out there that drags the small business guy who is creating the jobs. Simplify the tax brackets. You know, why don't we have zero capital gains tax to encourage investments? Repatriate the trillions of dollars that are offshore. All this makes sense. Something happens when everybody arrives in D.C. Nothing happens. And this, you know, this comprehensive versus maybe we just need to do one at a time and get some things done so that people are encouraged that we can see some change.
Well, you've got this, as I said, sort of this distance where the White House might be willing to do something less and the Congress wants to do more. And the reason is, as Tim pointed out, how large the U.S. economy is. When you narrow the scope of tax reform, you have less impact on the economy. And so if you do just corporate's 9% of federal revenues right now. So you're not going to get the kind of, most of business activities in a pass-through form. So if you don't do that, you know, what impact? So yes, they could do less, and I think the fallback will be to do something less if they can't move a larger package. I mean, there's some differences between 86 and now, and so I do think but that's why the Congress would like to do more permanent, and because of this growth issue they see, and I think the White House would like to, again, move the ball forward and make some progress. So we'll see where that ends up at the end of the day. But at least it is helpful that you had this sort of this joint group. They called them the Big Six: the Secretary of the Treasury, the Director of the NEC, Gary Cohn, the heads of the two committees, Finance and Ways and Means, and the two leaders, Speaker Ryan and Leader McConnell, that they were meeting and sort of developed this framework. Now they've sent this back to the Congress to develop the details, but what you'll see is sort of this group of six being the tiebreaker. For example, they did walk away from the border adjustment, which the Speaker and the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee did not want to do. So that group will help. Hopefully you won't have the same issue as you had in the health care bill, where the House was on one planet, the Senate was on another, and it made it very difficult to reconcile the two. Hopefully you'll see with that group of six at least some effort. I would love to have been able to have meetings with the Secretary of the Treasury. I did have meetings. He wasn't allowed to do anything. The president didn't let him have any authority. I'll just give you an example. When I did write the tax bill, I had spent 2 weeks going through it line by line with Democrats and Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee, going through it was an excruciating 2 weeks. And I invited the Treasury Department, which obviously was a President Obama Treasury Department, and in the 2 week period they made no comments. So they just didn't want to do anything. But you know, I think that we do have an opportunity here because there's a great deal of expectation, and the business community has made the case, and individuals have made the case that I think there's going to be incredible pressure to get something accomplished before 18. The midterms can be very harsh to the party in power.
Yeah.
And they'll want to have some accomplishments.
You know, Bill, I think to your question and to Dave's comment, one of the real interesting opportunities, you know, I'm not saying we could ever make this happen, but if you chose one big item, and you think about Chairman Camp's comment that, you know, we really don't, in the scope of things, bring in that much revenue in corporate income taxes, yet it has a real negatory effect on the functioning of the economy. Wouldn't it be an incredible thing if the United States just eliminated income taxes on corporations? And, you know, what would it mean to foreign businesses coming to the United States? What would it mean to repatriation of dollars, et cetera? So, you know, if you believe that the engine of this economy is business, if you believe that all jobs, even government jobs, stem from the fact that somebody's got to pay taxes, right, you know, that's a big issue. That's an issue that, you know, could make national headlines and could put the United States on a track for growth and economic opportunity like we haven't seen well before the Reagan tax cuts.
There is this whole line of thought, you know, obviously corporations, quote, don't pay taxes because they just pass it along. And so the Senate has worked on something called corporate integration. You'll hear about this as we get into the debate, which is that dividends will be paid at the recipient level, not at the corporate level. Right now, there's a double tax on those. And so there'll be a credit to the corporation, and that could significantly reduce the corporate tax rate. It's something that the House has not been part of, but the Senate is very interested in that, and I think you'll see that potentially come out. It's not without its detractors. Look, I always say, again, taxes like physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So no matter what path you take down, there will be significant pushback. It's just, I think one of the challenges they've had so far is because there isn't a total package out there, you're talking about it provision by provision. Well, obviously, if you go provision by provision, there's a good reason not to do any of it. But if you can get a total package where you can get the growth rate, the jobs numbers, and what that individual provision might mean in the entire context, I think you have a better chance of moving it forward. So hopefully, we won't get a whole lot of piecemealing of this, that they'll come out with a package and introduce it all at once.
Great.
Philip's got a question.
Thank you. There's a good comment about not consumption. Business is the engine for our economy. And if you bring that back to Michigan specifically, you had a slide that said that we were growing at the fastest growth rate in GDP. And I question, is it business or consumption? And maybe you can expand on that. As, what is the driver? What's the engine?
Well, as you look at U.S. GDP or Michigan's GDP, certainly the largest single component, to your point, in GDP is consumption. Roughly 70% of the U.S. economy, and it's pretty much the same in Michigan as at the national level, is consumption. And so the real question is, when you're looking at consumption, what are those consumers consuming? And in essence, they're consuming what business produces. So in essence, if you look at the old mathematical equation, y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m, exports minus imports, that c includes business activity because, to Dave's point, consumers are really, in essence, what pay the taxes. But the big question about that 70% under C, or the consumer, what are those consumers buying? Largely, they're buying things produced by companies, by businesses.
Another item that's driving tax reform is the activity at the international level from the European Union called the state aid cases. You may have read about Apple in Ireland and also what's called the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and what they call this BEPS process, base erosion and profit shifting. And this is really viewed as an area where the U.S. has become a target. And pretty much those investigations at the EU are targeting U.S. multinationals, and that's actually bringing some of the parties together a bit on an issue on why we need to do something on the international level.
Trustee George Hess has a question. The microphone, if we could pass that over to her, pass it right on down. There we go.
Thank you. It's a little bit for Tim, intended for Tim, and bringing it back to the engine that what drives our country. I live in Texas and resident of Texas, and I live right in the middle of all that economic development that's going on in Texas. So literally with Toyota right by them, there's a $5 billion of development going on right in that area. So you would think, wow, this is great, right, for the local community and having all that growth. But it's interesting, to your point about the small business guy who's been there for 20 years, you're just seeing them closing down in the midst of all these cranes being developed. And I was asking, like, what's going on? And that's really what is happening. It's a catch-22. You have all this great development, big companies moving in, lots of new chains of restaurants and businesses, but then the little guy, the entrepreneur who's been there forever, is getting squeezed out, and literally it was, a lot of it on having to raise his rates, but it's all related back to the taxes. So it's just, it's interesting to be in the middle of that, so I appreciate your comments to hear about the ripple effect, I guess. Right. Yeah. And it is totally a catch-22 for driving the engine.
You're absolutely right, Mary Ellen, and as you look at the great state of Texas, and I mean that, in so many ways, as Dave's noted, Texas is one of the best states in the country for regulations. Very, very pro-business. In most categories, low regulations. But as you look at Texas, the real problem is going to be, can you pick winners and losers with tax reform? Can you attract businesses? You know, Texas has no income tax for businesses and/or individuals, which is a great incentive to be in Texas. But as property taxes on both corporations and individuals continue to increase, that creates problems, and it's going to be a long-term variable. You know, Texas, in our competitiveness study, has been number one 4 out of the 5 years in terms of the most economically competitive state. But that's a snapshot that can change over time. Michigan's gone from 47 down to, you know, a real much better number to be announced pretty soon. So look for that. But the point is, these things ebb and flow over time, and the other variable that you need to take a look at is that states over time that use tax incentives to attract businesses. I remember listening to Governor Engler talk about this in Michigan, and Governor Engler always used to say, there are two problems with tax reform. Can we pick using tax incentives to get businesses to locate in the state? Can we pick the winners and losers as government? Probably not. But more important, what are you saying to the existing businesses that have been here with you through thick and thin, when you oftentimes have to raise taxes elsewhere to pay for this business to come into the state? And in some cases, it's your competitor. And so you're paying to have businesses come to the state. You're paying for the roads, the infrastructure needed to locate that new business, maybe additional taxes to pay for the kids in those areas. So it's a slippery slope, and I would not count the great state of Texas out. I think that Texas is going to rebound, but there are reasons to be concerned about what's going on in Texas.
Okay, if we can get the microphone back to Dr. Stahauer. She has a question in the back of the room.
As you've both pointed out, the global economy has a major impact on what we can do nationally. What do we see with the NAFTA talks starting up, NAFTA in play again, and the interplay in our economic ecosystem between trade policy and the potential for tax reform?
Yeah, trade is actually the other area that I think the president may take pretty significant action, and obviously they're renegotiating NAFTA, not walking away from it. So that is a sort of a difference. But and I do think there are a lot of things that have changed since 1993 when NAFTA was passed. So we'll have to see. It's a little unclear what direction they're going to do in trade. The president, any president, has pretty much unilateral authority in the trade area. And so a lot of the laws that the president has at his disposal have been used very rarely or not used at all. But the president can almost do anything there compared to other areas. It does look as though their attention is going to be toward China, particularly the technology transfer requirements that the state-owned enterprises in China require, and the rules and regulations, and the new trade representative who's just been confirmed just before the August break has instituted a 301 action, which could take about a year to do the analysis. But it says that I think this is an area that the president wants to do some significant, he'd been reviewing steel, now reviewing, I think, the technology area. And so this is, I think, going to be a continual part. So when I mentioned sort of the three areas the president's going to be involved in, I think trade is also going to be another important one. And we'll see. I know that I was part of the negotiations in the Korean, Colombian, and Panama trade agreements. I know how challenging those can be. So we'll have to see. Obviously, the countries have certain interests they want to protect. I do think, though, with trade, you're better off with a rule-based system than without a rule-based system. Now, they're not perfect because people don't always follow the rules, so you do need strong enforcement components as well. But trade is about getting advantage. That's what trade is about. So you're going to continually have pressures regardless of what relationships or agreements you have. But I do think you're better off with that than without it. And clearly, And part of the district I represented had manufacturing, but the largest industry in the district was agriculture, and a lot of farmers are looking for new markets because most of the population is outside the United States. So I always felt it was important to try to find new markets and explore. I was disappointed that they aren't moving forward on TPP personally, because I do think that TPP would be a counterweight to China, with a lot of countries in that region, Malaysia, Vietnam, and others. And with us withdrawing from that, I think you'll see them now look to China. And I would rather have a rule-based trade system with American values than I would the other way around. So we'll see where that goes long term. It appears as though the administration is going to be more interested in bilateral trade agreements than multilateral trade agreements. And obviously they've talked about something with Great Britain, but relatively new trade representative, and his first action is really this 301 investigation with regard to Chinese technology, or the requirement of technology transfer with China.
Yeah, I would take the following position. I take the following position on trade. Number one, clearly, since the World Trade Organization was founded, trade among countries has dramatically increased, and that's a good thing. You know, Dr. Seehower could quote this chapter and verse with her vast background in political science, and you know, she truly is a scholar in a lot of these areas. Traveled quite a bit in this regard. I think the real issue today is that we forget how many wars and how many conflicts have taken place in the last 100 years because of trade barriers. I mean, even as Dave noted, we ought not be celebrating the Confederacy or debating the Confederacy, but literally the number one reason for the Civil War, you know, President Lincoln looked at things differently. Much of it was over trade, whether the South should have to send raw cotton to the North, or could they send it at a higher price to Europe. You know, so there, even within the history of this country, trade has been a component that the more trade we can do, the more open trade we can do, the better the relationships among and between peoples and countries. I'm not a fan of the president's, at least his rhetoric on trade. I think he is a person that tends to speak in situations, and when, as Dave noted, if he's going to deal country to country rather than regionally, this is an area where the size and scope of government will dramatically increase. You know, Dave correctly noted that there are a lot of people that say, hey, let's cut this area of government but then increase this other area. The net change is nothing, or it actually creates more government. And so in terms of trade, I'm a big believer in the more free and open trade we have, and the simpler trade we have, the better. But simultaneously, you know, we've got to address a lot of issues if we're going to compete. You know, Dave kind of touched on it with the city of Detroit. We spend more money per student on average for K through 12 education in this country than any country in the world, with the possible exception of Switzerland. So building intellectual capital at the K through 12 level, we are among the top. And our results are nothing to write home to mom and dad about. You know, we're below top 20 in math, in science, in reading. And so we have to deal with a lot of these variables. And if you have a free and competitive market and we don't have the intellectual capital and the employees to compete, it's going to be difficult.
Do we have one more question? Dick Garber, right here. Bring him the microphone.
Thanks, Keith. This is a question for Dr. Nash. Lots of discussion these days about autonomous vehicles. Maybe a little premature, but could you comment about the implications that might not have, not only on the Michigan economy, but the country's economy? And certainly, Dave, if you have any comments, I'd be interested in hearing them as well.
Boy, I can't wait to have an autonomous vehicle. You know, you think about all the work you could get done, and take a brief nap going from to and fro. I really believe that when you're looking at the autonomous vehicle, there's a lot of interesting debates, and I I appreciate the question, Dick, and it's a subject that fascinates me. I would put it back in your court and ask you what you think about it as well. But think about what's going to happen to the business of the automotive dealership, as an example. If we can truly bring to fruition this network of autonomous vehicles on the road, there are predictions that the service side of an automobile dealership's business could drop by anywhere from 30 to 70% because there'll be far fewer or no accidents. The real question that comes into play is what would happen to insurance rates? I've seen studies where people have predicted that your insurance premiums could drop by 50 to 70%, putting those dollars in your pocket, allowing people to buy more automobiles. You think about what insurance is like in the city of Detroit. You can pay $4,000 a year for insurance, and autonomous vehicles not only would park themselves and drive more safely, but the ability to inform somebody that the car is being tampered with or being stolen with all the technology that has to go into an autonomous vehicle, it's just mind-boggling. I think in the next 30 to 50 years, maybe hopefully sooner, we're going to have autonomous vehicles. And in the end, I think that it presents some challenges for, say, the retail auto industry. But simultaneously, I think over time, it will mean more automobiles on the road. It will mean better automobiles on the road. It will mean great things for, I think, companies, retailers, and citizens in general.
I actually rode in an autonomous vehicle when I was at Google visiting, and it was a little like cruise control. I mean, you cannot totally read a book while you're in an autonomous. I mean, you've got to still
not yet.
Not yet. I mean, this was a couple years ago, but I do think it is coming. It's the only comment I'd make. It was very interesting because the first time you go somewhere, you have to drive it because it's got to map it. So you're not going to you're going to have cars on the road that won't be autonomously driven, at least initially, because until the car scans and maps the route and figures what the fixtures are, you have to drive it. So it's going to be interesting how it develops. But I think the other major significant change is this electric vehicle issue, which is growing tremendously. And when I visit the people I see in California, they're very popular there. And a friend of mine had one and got a flat tire, and they called, before she was figuring out what to do, they called her and said, "You have a flat tire. We're coming to you." And she said, "Well, I've got this class. I've got to go to your, yoga class." And they changed the tire. She said, "Well, I'm on the corner." They go, "We know where you are," which she said was kind of creepy. But so this whole model is changing dramatically, very quickly.
We have one last question. Right here. Heidi?
Sitting here brewing if I should say anything or not, but everybody takes in what they're hearing from different filters and life experience, and Bill and I, we have 10 next generation in our family, and we've been very intentional on mentoring them and preparing them for this world they're walking into. And I'm sitting listening to all of you wonderful, intelligent men and your worldview on free enterprise, and I'm very burdened for this generation that's coming up and going to be voting and leading, and I see how challenging it is right now with the minds that we have, and I'm like, where's the hope? So I'm thankful for Northwood that you are training up. I just wish there were more and more institutions training up the free enterprise, the capitalism mindset, because there's a very strong movement of the socialist mindset, and it's very. Many of us in here are parents and grandparents, and not every child is going to have the opportunity to go to Northwood. There is an amazing tool that free enterprisers have created for parents and grandparents to do with families. It's called College Prep America, and it's a little thing. Just look it up, and then it's just helping train the next generation. But do you guys have any words of hope or things that we as parents and grandparents can be thinking about as we're talking to our next generation, send them to Northwood for their higher I'm serious. I mean, but what else can we?
That would be the first priority.
What did you say?
So that would be the first priority.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're 100%
Let's double.
there.
Let's
It's a
double
great
this.
segue, great last question. I appreciate it very much.
You can pay me later.
I don't know that I'm an expert on that. I mean, obviously being the parent of three myself, I think the real challenge is sort of the disparity you've got. You've got a group of kids that get all of sort of the background and values and education that you're talking about, but we have a segment that doesn't. And I think the real challenge going forward is going to be this disparity. Some of our public schools are excellent. I mean, I look at what the work my kids were doing in the Midland Public Schools. I didn't do some of that work in college. So I know that some schools do very well, others don't do as well. And so the opportunities aren't equal, particularly as you go around the country, even just within our state. But, whenever I sort of get discouraged about that, I would go to the academy appointments. One of the things you get to do as a member of Congress is nominate students to attend our military academies. And I would have between 50 and 60 applicants every year from the 4th District. And those kids would come through and I'd say, there's hope. Not all of them would get nominations. I mean, not all of them would get admitted to the academy. But when you saw the commitment that a lot of these young people have and just the values they bring to it, I do think there's hope. I think the challenge will be getting that broader. But, that's always been a case. I mean, I've seen some of those quotes from Aristotle where he talks about the next generation is wayward and not going to have the values. But it is an issue that I think we have to try to build on. But institutions like Northwood do a great job on that and continue to impact even those who didn't attend by being a leadership voice in the state and the community and in fact, the nation. So.
I would say that part of it's attitude, but attitude I think has to be based on fact, not fiction. And for me, when I look at my life, I had a grandfather that came over at age 13 from Ostrowiecka, Poland, to escape conscription in the Russian army. And even though the size and scope of immigration has changed, we ought to celebrate immigrants from all over the world and celebrate the fact that they're not, they're oftentimes running from something, but overall they're still running to something, meaning they see the American dream, they see the American competitive free enterprise system as an opportunity. I'm working on a paper with one of our McNair scholars, and one of the things that she and I have been working on as it relates to life expectancy. And it really wasn't until the freeing of people, starting in Europe and moving to the United States in the late 1700s, early 1800s, that we started to see significant change in life expectancy. And so when we ask ourselves, can we get get bogged down with difficult news? Certainly Dave and I haven't said it's a rosy future and we don't have challenges. But think about what it must have been like in 1900 when there were less than 8,000 automobiles on the road. We had less than 143 miles of paved roads in the United States in 1900. Life expectancy was 47 years of age. A young person born today is projected to live to at least 86 years of age. It took, for all of our automotive-related employers in the audience, it took 30 months of salary to buy a Ford Model T. Today, you can buy a really nice equivalent Ford in a number of different categories for less than a half year's wages. These are things that have happened because human beings believe in doing the impossible. After World War II, the national debt of the United States, it's about 104, 105% today. It was almost 130% of GDP. But we believe that we could make a difference. And I say this with all due respect to my friend Dave Camp. We need people like Dave Camp in Congress. We need people that are going to walk across the aisle and work together. And so when you think about these examples, the movie Wall Street is one of my favorite movies, not for the general theme of trashing Wall Street, because I'm a huge fan of Wall Street, But if you remember that scene, Michael Douglas in 1985, he's walking down the beach and he's got a cell phone and it looks like a brick with buttons, right? And all you could do was make phone calls. That phone cost $12,000 in 1985. And here's another issue that we have to think about. I love rich people. I'm not rich, I'm not poor, but I love rich people. And there's a great example of why I love rich people. Because who could afford to buy those phones? Rich people. Who could afford to pay for the original cell towers and test whether or not those cell phones worked? Rich people. And then thank God for those rich people because they were ripped off. 10 years later, 20 years later, today, think about it. Cell phones cost nothing because of that invention and innovation. So overall, I'm really optimistic, and I say camp for Senate.
No.
We're going to give Dave the last word
Yeah,
here.
if Nancy were here, she'd be running to another country. But I was at a dinner with David McCullough, the author who wrote John Adams, and we were talking about all of the things that he had gone through and the advances there. And so someone asked him a question: what will this time be known for? And he said, this time will be known for advances in medicine, since we're ending on a positive note. And when you look at, and I'm actually a personal testament to that, but when you look at the advances medicine has made and the life expectancies and the survival rates from diseases that would have killed people, cancer and others, it is really remarkable, the advances and positive changes that are available to us now today. And so I think that's an area when you think of what has gone well and what has improved in our lives, that's certainly one of them.
Yeah.
Well, Heidi, thank you for that question. And for those of us here in the audience this morning that heard one of our students, Kennedy Shea, speak last evening, we should all be optimistic about the future and the values that are still taught in today's world and still understood by this upcoming generation and can and will make a difference in our life and our world. And that's what we're all about at Northwood University. That's why we appreciate all of you being here this morning to be a part of this. Our thanks to Dave Camp for all he has done as a member of Congress and it continues to do with his knowledge of the tax structure. And hopefully we will see some action here in the next few weeks and months. But thank you for all you've done. Particularly thank you to you and your family for what you've done for our university since the very beginning of the founding of this institution. It's made a significant difference. And Tim, thank you for all you do on a daily basis to get this information out in an understandable fashion that can help us all to make better decisions. And one of those better decisions is to help send more and great students to Northwood University where they will get the values to lead this nation going forward. We have for you copies of In Defense of Capitalism, the 8th volume, are over here on the table. We hope you'll pick this up as you leave. You know, this is a publication that includes some of the writings of our faculty and staff, but also some of the writings of our students are in here. And you will see very clearly there is a positive future for our country. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the weekend.